According to a 2019 study, 40% of respondents said they had been laid off or terminated at least once. So why does it feel so shameful to announce we've lost our job? As of July of 2023, nearly 194,000 U.S. employees lost their jobs in more than 150 major layoffs so far in 2023. In the tech industry alone, there have been over 250,000 employees laid off in 2023 since the time of writing this script, as reported by layoffs.fyi. Now we have a presidential candidate promising to lay off 1.5 million federal workers when already the layoffs we have experienced feel like a national mental health crisis. I would know. I was laid off this year. Louis Hyman, director for the Institute for Workplace Studies at Cornell, says layoffs are an opportunity to reimagine strategy and get coverage by the media. And it's true. Who doesn't remember going out of their way to buy Hostess cakes after their bankruptcy in 2012? When businesses fail, we go out of our way to consume their products. But should we be rewarding these companies? Author of The Disposable American, Louis Uchitel, claims that from the 1890s through the 1970s, layoffs were seen as a sign of corporate failure and a violation of acceptable business behavior. So how have they become so commonplace in America? Although layoffs were seen more negatively in the days of the company man, there is still more than a century's worth of history of layoffs in the U.S. During the Industrial Revolution, as the climate of production shifted from using skilled workers to machines, there were mass layoffs of skilled workers. Business needs changed from needing skilled textile workers, for example, to unskilled workers who could operate the new machines. It's important to note there were also no laws protecting workers' rights to unionize prior to World War I. There were limited government regulations and worker protections during this time period. When the stock market crashed in 1929, America was thrust into the Great Depression, where unemployment numbers reached as high as 25% due to widespread layoffs and business closures. However, those numbers only represented America as a whole. There were individual regions and cities that were hit harder than others. For example, nearly 90% of the workforce in Lowell, Massachusetts was unemployed by 1933. One interesting tidbit I found while researching this video was that the layoffs during this time period were actually discriminatory. Women were the first group of people laid off due to the assumption that their husbands would take care of them. Then more than 66% of Black men were let go. In June of 1933, the National Industrial Recovery Act was signed into law by FDR, giving workers the right to unionize and negotiate collectively for higher wages and better working conditions. The Glass-Steagall Act was also created that year, ensuring the separation of the commercial and investment sectors of the banking industry. In 1935, FDR launched a second series of federal programs, including the Works Progress Administration, which provided jobs for unemployed people. These largely were jobs building things like schools, highways, and post offices, but the WPA also provided job opportunities for artists like writers, directors, and musicians. This set of government programs also gave us the National Labor Relations Act, which created a board to supervise union elections, and the Social Security Act, which set up a system of unemployment insurance. At a rally for his campaign for a second term, FDR told a crowd, "The forces of organized money are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred." He won his second term in a landslide 98.49% electoral college victory, securing 60.8% of the popular vote. However, despite the legislation he was passing, the conservative majority on the Supreme Court kept invalidating these reform initiatives, arguing that these initiatives were unconstitutional and an overuse of power. Sound familiar? To prevent further meddling by the court, FDR announced a plan to pack the court with liberal justices to neutralize the conservative justices' votes. This announcement worked because after the conservative justices learned of the plan, they began to vote to uphold FDR's New Deal projects. In 1941, the United States entered World War II. The stimulation to the economy ended the Great Depression and thus gave rise to the U.S. military-industrial complex. Eventually, America was able to recover spectacularly due to the post-World War II economic boom. More than 17 million jobs were created in military-related industries. Industrial unions held a lot of power. The Treaty of Detroit, for example, was negotiated between General Motors and United Auto Workers. This contract stated that contract terms would be negotiated every 5 years, strikes wouldn't be conducted by the workers, and in return, layoffs wouldn't be conducted. The modern era of mass layoffs begins in the 1970s when U.S. manufacturers faced increasing competition from foreign manufacturers, particularly in Japan and South Korea. The demand for American-made goods decreased, and thus so did the industry. At the same time, the manufacturing industry was seeing a lot of technological improvement, making some jobs obsolete with the rise of computers and more complex automated manufacturing. A lot of these formerly industrial regions are still affected by the economic downturn to this day. The Harvard Business Review published a research study that claims that in former industrial regions in both the US and UK, people reported more unhappy personality traits, lower life satisfaction, and lower life expectancy than otherwise similar regions where these industries did not dominate. The 80s gave rise to corporate restructuring. Louis Uchitel writes in The Disposable American that the pattern of using mergers and acquisitions to chase higher and higher profits while closing or shrinking or selling less promising operations spread widely to corporate America, and layoffs greased the way. As American manufacturing continued to decline, the labor movement was weakened as many unions were concentrated in manufacturing industries. This continued with the Reagan administration, which was anti-union and actively supported employer efforts to weaken them. This led to a decline in union memberships, weakening the bargaining power of workers and making it easier for corporations to dictate terms of employment. In the 1980s, GE chairman Jack Welch popularized layoffs as a sign of corporate competitiveness. And why wouldn't he? He was responsible for reducing GE's workforce by 118,000 workers between 1980 and 1985. Corporations began to focus on shareholder value as the popularity of neoliberalism rose. Neoliberalism argues that corporations are primarily responsible to their shareholders and that government interference in corporate affairs should be minimized. In addition, globalization led to more competition among corporations. Corporations began looking to reduce costs while also streamlining operations, which meant more layoffs. In 1996, Newsweek wrote, "Once upon a time, it was a mark of shame to fire your workers en masse. It meant you had messed up your business. Today, the more people a company fires, the more Wall Street loves it and the higher its stock price goes." This leads us to the dot-com bubble burst. For those unfamiliar, internet-related tech companies attracted attention from investors in the late 90s to about 2001 as the internet became more accessible to people. While the web sector was exploding in valuation, many companies didn't have clear paths to profitability. The streams of money these companies were relying on went dry in late 2000 and the industry imploded. Internet stocks began to lose value and the sell-off of those stocks continued until October 2002. Yes, this affected the market for 2 years. So how many people were laid off? The Silicon Valley Business Journal reports an estimated 2 million people were laid off in 2001 alone. That's 8 times as many people as were laid off in the tech industry this year. What happens next? Well, I forgot to mention that Glass-Steagall was repealed in 1999, giving rise to predatory loans. Housing prices soared due to the influx of new home buyers, and within 9 years of the repeal of Glass-Steagall, the financial crisis began. It lasted 18 months, and the economy didn't recover until 2015. There were mass layoffs between December 2007 and early 2010. An estimated 8.7 million Americans lost their jobs. 1 in every 54 homes in America was in foreclosure, and 10 million Americans lost their homes. Thanks, Clinton. This brings us to the pandemic. I think we all still have a collective memory of what happened during the pandemic, so I won't wax on too much about it. What's important to note is that 41.7 million people in the U.S. lost their jobs in 2020. That's 25% of the U.S. workforce. And that brings us to today. So we know all about the history of layoffs. Now what happens to the worker? On average, it's estimated to take 2 years to recover from the psychological trauma of losing a job. A study showed that most workers who lost their jobs during the 1981 recession still earned 20% less than those who had retained their jobs 20 years later. In addition, the Harvard Business Review writes that the psychological and financial pressure of being laid off can increase the risk of suicide by 1.3 to 3 times. Displaced workers have twice the risk of developing depression, 4 times the risk of substance abuse, and 6 times the risk of committing violent acts, including partner and child abuse. The stress induced by a layoff can even impair fetal development. In fact, one study found that being laid off ranked 7th among the most stressful life experiences, more stressful than divorce, a sudden and serious impairment of hearing or vision, or the death of a close friend. If layoffs are this awful, traumatic, life-altering event, is it at least worth it? Well, not really. A study that focused on Fortune 1000 firms between 2003 and 2007 found that firms that had layoffs underperformed firms that did not conduct layoffs. In fact, 2 decades of profitability studies show that the majority of firms that conduct layoffs do not see improved profitability, whether measured by return on assets, return on equity, or return on sales. The Harvard Business Review claims that episodic restructuring and routine layoffs damage employee engagement and company profitability in the long run. The short-term cost savings are not only overshadowed by these consequences, but by higher rates of voluntary turnover and lower innovation. In fact, downsizing a workforce by 1% leads to a 31% increase in voluntary turnover the next year. A 2002 study found that after a layoff, those who remained at a company after a layoff experienced a 41% decline in job satisfaction, a 36% decline in organizational commitment, and a 20% decline in job performance. So, where does this leave us? I don't know. In my research, I found alternatives to layoffs that other companies have utilized. When Siemens Energy announced they would be terminating 3,000 workers in Germany, the IG Metall Union negotiated with the company and got them to agree to reduce its German workforce only through buyouts and attrition. The 1,700 workers in the US who were also announced to be laid off were simply laid off, despite the more humane treatment of their German counterparts. There aren't just solutions at the company level. Finland, for example, requires that any companies with more than 20 employees must go through a formal consultation procedure considering alternatives to layoffs. Policies like these could be introduced in the US, but just as in FDR's time, the sentiment of the people needs to change for the policies to change. In 2017, 48% of non-union workers said they would vote to unionize their workplace if they could. The Economic Policy Institute estimates that this means more than 60 million workers wanted to join a union but couldn't. Just as with the Treaty of Detroit, the workers need protections in place to have job security. This doesn't necessarily mean unionizing either. As mentioned earlier, countries like Finland have policies in place to prevent mass layoffs. As far as my own mass layoff, after 9 months of unemployment, I hardly feel like I worked there at all. It was a role the company had created when it was doing well and eliminated the moment business wasn't doing well anymore. How are you supposed to process that if not with time? I went through the grieving process. I was angry for a long time. I was depressed, but I think I've come to accept it now for what it was. Something shitty that happened and that has a long history of happening to Americans. I'm not alone in my psychological or physical issues. Maybe there's something powerful in that too, or devastating, however you want to look at it. With all the negative consequences of layoffs, it seems like it would be good business practice to not conduct them, but a simple video about layoffs is very unlikely to change the collective narrative around layoffs in the USA. Maybe it will help humanize and destigmatize those who go through layoffs, though, and maybe that's enough.